this video, we're going to talk about dynamic data masking. Now, it is a security feature, but it's not really all that secure. That's the first thing you need to know about dynamic data masking, because at the end, what it's doing is once your query output is generated, it's just adding a layer on top of the final output. So someone with permissions would be able to go ahead and bypass that security layer that you've added on top. And it's not really like encryption, where the underlying data itself has been transformed into some other value. So there are ways and mechanisms through which we can still figure out what's going on. And that is why you need to be careful when you implement dynamic data masking, because it's not a standalone feature that will protect your data. It's something that you add in addition to some other features that you might already be using, such as always encrypted, etc. Now, the best way to understand this is to actually try it out. So what we're going to do is we have our database here. It's called secdb1. I'm going to use the secdb1, and I'm going to create the table. And if you look over here, as far as dynamic data masking is concerned, there are a couple of different ways that you can create it. The first one being the default. And in default, what happens is that you don't really customize the masked information. There are certain standard templates that are used. For example, if it's a number, it usually defaults to 0. And if it's a date, it'll default to 1st of January 1900. And that's kind of the idea with the default. So when you don't really want to specify a particular type of information, you can just go ahead and put default, and everything just gets defaulted to some random, not random value, but a fixed value of 0 for integer or numeric data types, etc. You also have the other option, which is random. As you can see here, when I use random function, what happens is I specify a range. So this is useful for numbers and things like that. So you'll see that I've specified a range of 1000 to 20,000 for the column age. You'll also see that for date, we have specified default. In addition to this, there's a function that you can use, which is email, which will give you an indication that what you're dealing with is an email ID. It'll give you the first character and the suffix of the email, so .com, etc. And if you don't like any of these, you can go ahead and customize it yourself by using partial, where you get to define how you would like to see the output. So this is, again, in this case, as you can see here, I've got a phone number which is in a varchar 20, and I'm specifying that I need to see the first character and the last 3 characters, and then in the middle I want to put the string here. So it doesn't really matter how many characters are in the middle, it's always going to be this value here. So it's going to be like XX-XX-XXX. You could have 20 characters here, 30 characters, it doesn't really matter. And then I've got one column which is just empty, so that I can show you what it looks like. So the first thing will be obviously to go ahead and insert some data into the table. And this data is now being masked on top of what's already existing. So if I look over here, I can go ahead and create a user called dynamic data masking user, DDM. And I'm going to give him permission to go ahead and select off the table. But just because he has select permissions doesn't necessarily mean that he will be able to view the data in its raw format. So let's have a look here. So I'm going to say execute as the user DDM user, the one that we just created. And I'm going to give a select permission on top of it. And you can see immediately that when I do this, default obviously defaults to 0, name defaults to XXX, because again, it's got default over here. And if you look at the age, you'll see that it's a random value between 1000 and 20,000. Date of birth again is defaulted, so you can see that it's defaulting to the 1st of January 1900. Date time, on the other hand, you can see that it's defaulting with 0 milliseconds, etc. And then you have email. As you can see, it's g@something.com. Pretty obvious that we can make out that this is an email ID. And then you have partial, which is something that I think most people typically use to validate the last 3 numbers of the credit card, stuff like that. So definitely something that I think will be used more frequently than the other guys here. I see these guys being used occasionally in moving data from production environments to test environments, etc. And there's an assumption that because they have mastered the data is safe. And if you're a DBA doing that, I want you to understand that this is not protecting your data. There are ways that your development DBA or developers can actually get access to the underlying data. And we'll see that in a minute. So there we go. So that's basically it. So you can see at this point, the user has a select permission on the table, but cannot see the raw data. Now, in the off chance you want to see the user, or the user wants to see the data, the user should be given the permission grant unmasked to DDM user. Now, one thing that I do not like about this feature is that it doesn't really specifically ask you to go ahead and define the table on which you want to unmask. So you'll see that the command is simply grant unmask, unlike the one that we have here, which says grant select on. So once you grant unmask, pretty much any table on which masking is employed can be unmasked by the user, and that I think is something that Microsoft should be looking into. So let's go ahead and grant unmask permissions to the user now. So I'm going to go ahead and grant him unmask permissions and then reconnect as the DDM user. And this time around, when I query it, you'll see that I'm able to see the raw data. And that's pretty much what you want to keep in mind as far as dynamic data masking is concerned. You can see that how once permission is given, he's able to go ahead and view the data. So one thing that I did want to show you was how this feature gets bypassed. So I'm going to revoke the permission over here, and let's go ahead and run this again. And you'll see that again the data is masked. But what I can do as the developer is, for example, where age, if you look over here, I specified my age over here as 22. I could just as easily come over here and say where age less than 10. And when I do that, you'll see that I don't get any results. I can say age less than 20 and I don't get any results. Age less than 22, I don't get any results. Age less than 23, and I get results. So there are ways that the user can query the information to get an idea about the underlying information that's there. So for email IDs, a simple example would be you use like@gmail.com to figure out all the Gmail IDs, and then look for dot in the Gmail ID to figure out if it's a first name dot last name combination or something of that sort. So because of the patterns that we use for certain fields, it's pretty easy to take a good educated guess in terms of what the data could potentially look like and then start querying it that way. So that is why it's important for you to understand that dynamic data masking is not a security feature per se. It is just an additional layer that you're adding on top of your data. So keep that in mind when you're working with this, because it is, again, like I showed you, easy to bypass it. So again, this is something that will not protect you from your database developers or someone who has privileged access to the database. It's mainly meant to protect your data from the casual observer. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.